A ring meant nothing if it was rented, and Lim Dong Brim knew the moment he saw it catch the light that something about this proposal was already a lie. He sat alone at a corner table in a private dining room in Beacon Hill, a glass of bourbon untouched in front of him, watching a man named Holloway drop to one knee in front of his entire family. The room had gone soft with candlelight and string music, the kind of setup built for a video that would get shared 1,000 times. Holloway's mother had her phone up before he even finished kneeling. His father was grinning like he already knew the answer. Coco Addison sat frozen in her chair, her napkin still folded in her lap, her face doing something complicated, not surprise, not joy, something closer to math. She was running numbers in her head, the way she did when a server threw an error she didn't expect. Holloway opened the ring box. The diamond was big, almost embarrassingly big, the kind of stone that asked to be photographed instead of worn. "Coco Addison," he said, loud enough for the room, "will you marry me?" She looked at the ring, then she looked at him, then she said the word that would end up online by morning. "No!" The quartet didn't stop playing right away, which made the silence after even louder. Holloway's mother lowered her phone slowly, like she didn't trust what she'd just recorded. His father's face went from pink to red in under 3 seconds. "Say that again?" Holloway said, his voice dropping into something Coco recognized immediately. The private voice. The one that never came out in public, except it just had. "You heard me the first time," she said. He stood up fast, the chair scraping against hardwood, and grabbed her wrist hard enough that she winced before she could stop herself. "You're embarrassing me in front of my family. You embarrassed yourself the second you decided to do this in public, so I couldn't say no without making a scene," she said, and she pulled her wrist free with a strength that surprised him. "I told you 3 weeks ago I wasn't ready. You didn't listen then either." His mother stood up. "Ungrateful," she said, just loud enough to be heard. "After everything this family has done for you." Coco didn't answer her. She picked up her purse, looked at Holloway one last time like she was filing him away in a folder she planned to delete, and walked out of the private room into the cold Boston night without a coat. She made it half a block before the tears came, not from sadness, but from the kind of rage that needed somewhere to go. That ring was rented, by the way. She spun around. A man was standing a few feet behind her, hands in the pockets of a coat that probably cost more than her rent, dark hair, sharp eyes, an accent that rounded his vowels in a way that didn't belong to Boston. She didn't recognize him, but something about the way he said it, flat, dry, like he was reporting weather, made her laugh despite everything. "Excuse me?" "The ring," he said again. "I know a jeweler on Newbury Street who rents stones that size for events. Your fiancé's family has used him twice before." Different woman the first time. Coco wiped her face with the back of her hand, half offended, half grateful for something to focus her anger on besides her own humiliation. "Who are you?" "Lim Dong Brim," he said. "I was at the dinner, different table. You watched that whole thing happen and didn't say anything. I watched you say no in front of 40 people who expected you to say yes," he said. "I didn't think you needed me to say anything. You handled it." That stopped her. Nobody, not her mother, not her friends, not a single person in that restaurant, had said anything close to that yet. Everyone else would spend the next week asking if she was okay, if she was sure, if she'd thought it through. This stranger just told her she'd handled it. "Let me give you a ride home," he said. "It's cold, and you don't have a coat, and I promise I'm not going to ask you about the ring, or the man, or any of it, unless you bring it up first." She should have said no. She'd just said no to one man tonight already, and her instinct was screaming at her to keep the streak going. But there was something in the calm of him, something that didn't ask for anything, that made her nod instead. In the car, the silence held for almost 2 full minutes before she broke it herself. "You said you know that jeweler," she said. "How do you know Holloway's family that well?" "I'm an investor in a few Cambridge biotech companies," he said. "Halcyon for one." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. "I work at Halcyon." "I know," he said. "Senior security engineer. You patched a vulnerability in the access control system in March that saved us a very expensive headache. I read the incident report." "You read incident reports?" "I read everything that touches my investments," he said, and there was the faintest smile, gone as quickly as it came. "You're better at your job than most people who outrank you. If you're already hooked, watching Coco walk away from that ring, do me a favor and smash that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think happens next, and subscribe, because trust me, it gets a lot more intense from here." Now back to the story. The car pulled up outside her apartment in Somerville. Neither of them moved for a second. "Thank you for the ride," she said, "and for not asking." "You're welcome," he said. And Coco, for what it's worth, the right person doesn't need an audience to ask you something that matters. She didn't have a response to that. She got out of the car before she had to come up with one, and she didn't look back. But she thought about that sentence the entire way up 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, long after the sound of his car had disappeared down the street. 2 years earlier, Holloway had been a different man, or at least he'd been good at pretending to be. He took her to dinner in the North End on their 3rd date and ordered for her without asking, which she found charming back then instead of controlling. He told her she was the smartest woman he'd ever dated, that her job at Halcyon was impressive, that he loved how she explained complicated systems in ways that made him feel smart too. Her mother, Denise, approved of him instantly, a man from a good Brookline family, polite at dinner, the kind of son-in-law that made other mothers jealous at church. The shift happened slowly enough that Coco almost didn't notice it happening at all. It started with small comments. He'd joke that her hours at work were a lot for someone who was supposed to be building a life with him. He'd ask why she needed to go out with her co-workers after a deadline instead of coming home. Small things, easy to explain away, easy to apologize for on his behalf, in her own head, before he even had to do it himself. Then came the money. He started a consulting business 18 months into the relationship, full of confidence, talking about clients that never quite materialized. The first time he asked to borrow from her savings, it was framed as temporary, $3,000, to cover a contractor he hadn't been paid by yet. She said yes, because she loved him, and because saying no felt cruel when he looked at her like she was the only person who believed in him. It was never just $3,000. By the time they got engaged, he owed her almost $20,000, money he never once mentioned paying back unless she brought it up first. And when she did bring it up, the conversation always ended the same way. "You're going to bring up money right now," he'd said the last time she tried. "After everything I do for you." "What do you do for me, Holloway?" His face had changed in a way that used to scare her before she got used to it. "I introduced you to people who matter. I took you to dinners with my family. You think you'd have half the confidence you have now if I hadn't built you up." She'd gotten a promotion at Halcyon 3 months before the engagement dinner, lead security architect, a title that came with a number attached to it that was almost double what Holloway made on a good month. He hadn't congratulated her. He'd gone quiet for 2 days, then snapped at her over something small, a dish left in the sink, in a voice that made her flinch, even though he'd never once raised his hand to her. "You think because you got promoted, you don't have to clean up after yourself anymore?" He'd said, "That has nothing to do with my promotion. Everything has something to do with it lately," he said. You walk around here like you don't need anybody." That was the truest thing he'd ever said to her, and he meant it as an insult. The night of the engagement dinner, she'd told him 3 separate times in the weeks before that she wasn't ready, that something in her had quietly closed a door she hadn't told him about yet. He didn't listen because he'd already booked the restaurant, already called his family, already decided the proposal was happening with or without her actual answer factored into the plan. Now, walking into Halcyon's Cambridge office on Monday morning, 2 days after the worst dinner of her life, Coco found out exactly how far Holloway's family was willing to go to save face. "Everyone's talking about it," her co-worker Theodora said quietly, falling into step beside her in the hallway. "The video's already got like 40,000 views. Someone at the dinner posted it." Coco's stomach dropped. "Posted what?" "Exactly. You saying no. Mostly that part. Some of his mother's reaction too." "Great," Coco said. "Wonderful. Love that for me." She made it to her desk and had barely opened her laptop when her manager, Bertram, knocked on the edge of her cubicle wall. "Got a minute? New board member wants to sit in on the security review this afternoon." "What new board member?" "Lim Dong Brim," Bertram said, checking his tablet. "Majority investor. He's taking an active seat starting this week, which apparently means he's going to be a lot more visible around here than the last guy." Coco's pulse did something complicated. "He's going to be here, in this building, regularly. That a problem?" "No," she said, too fast. "No problem." She spent the rest of the morning trying not to think about a car ride 2 nights earlier and failing completely. The security review happened in a glass-walled conference room at 2 in the afternoon, 12 people around a table, half of them barely paying attention until Dong Brim walked in and the energy in the room visibly shifted. He took the seat directly across from her without making it look intentional, though she suspected everything he did was intentional. "Walk us through the access logs from last quarter," he said, looking at her, not at Bertram, not at anyone else in the room. She did, and she did it well, because she always did her job well, regardless of how distracted she felt underneath it. He asked 2 follow-up questions that proved he'd actually read the documentation beforehand, which more than half the room clearly hadn't. "Good catch on the authentication gap in Section 4, he said when she finished. "Most people miss that. Most people don't read past the executive summary," she said, before she could stop herself. A few people in the room laughed. Dong Brim didn't laugh, but something in his face shifted into amusement, quiet and contained. After the meeting, he found her in the hallway, 2 coffee cups in hand, one of which he held out toward her, like it had always been meant for her. "You didn't have to do that," she said, taking it anyway. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to do anything you didn't ask for. I just thought you'd want coffee." "That's a very specific kind of careful," she said, studying him. "I have a feeling you don't respond well to anything that isn't," he said. She took a sip and realized he'd remembered exactly how she took it from a single observation 2 nights earlier in the car, when she'd mentioned in passing that she hated sugar in coffee. She hadn't expected him to be listening that closely. She wasn't sure how she felt about the fact that he had been. Word traveled fast through Coco's family, the way it always did, and by Wednesday, her mother Denise was calling every 2 hours, like the engagement video had personally wounded her. "You humiliated that family," Denise said, the moment Coco picked up. "In front of everyone. Do you understand what people are saying about you?" "I don't care what people are saying about me, Mum. You should care. Holloway's mother called me crying. She said you embarrassed her son in front of 40 guests. He proposed to me in front of 40 guests after I told him 3 separate times I wasn't ready," Coco said, gripping the phone tighter. "He didn't ask me. He performed at me. You could have said yes, and worked it out privately later. Married people figure things out. You didn't have to do it like that. Mum, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a mark. There was a pause on the line, long enough that Coco thought maybe, finally, this would be the moment her mother actually heard her. He was upset, Denise said instead. You embarrassed him. Coco hung up without saying goodbye, something she'd never done to her mother in 29 years, and sat on the edge of her bed, feeling more alone than she had in a long time. Over the next 2 weeks, the strangeness of her mother's pressure started to feel less like ordinary disappointment and more like something with a motive behind it, though Coco couldn't name what yet. Denise brought it up at every phone call, every visit, pushing harder than the situation seemed to warrant for a woman who'd never once pushed Coco toward anything in her adult life. Meanwhile, at Halcyon, something stranger was unfolding that had nothing to do with her personal life at all. She found it by accident on a Thursday night, running a routine audit on the access logs after everyone else had gone home, the kind of late hour where she did her best thinking because nobody needed anything from her. A pattern caught her eye. Small data pulls from the proprietary research server, timestamps scattered across months, never large enough on their own to trip an alert, but together they added up to something deliberate. She traced the access credentials back as far as she could before the trail went cold, scrubbed clean by someone who knew just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be careful. Whoever did this had used an old employee login that should have been deactivated months ago. Her stomach turned when she recognized the account. It was hers, an old one, from before she'd been issued new credentials after her promotion. The login had been deactivated on paper, but someone had clearly still had access to it. She sat very still for a long moment, running through everyone who'd ever had access to her devices, her passwords, the parts of her life that lived behind a screen. Only one person came to mind who'd had that kind of access without her noticing, because she'd trusted him enough not to look. Holloway had used her laptop a dozen times over the course of their relationship, working from her apartment when his own internet went down, claiming he just needed a quiet place to focus. She'd never thought twice about it. Why would she? He wasn't a security engineer. He didn't know the first thing about credential theft, except someone had taught him, or someone had done it for him. She didn't tell anyone yet. Not Bertram, not Dongbrim, not even herself in full, because some part of her needed to be completely sure before she let the thought take real shape. She started pulling logs quietly, after hours, backing up everything she found onto an external drive she kept at her own apartment, far away from any system Holloway or his family might somehow still touch. Dongbrim noticed something was different about her that week, the way a person notices a friend going quiet before they understand why. "You've been distracted," he said, catching her in the break room on Friday afternoon, the building mostly empty for early weekend departures. Distracted, but not in the way you were the first week. Different kind of distracted. "Just tired," she said. "You're a terrible liar for someone who works in security." She almost laughed. "I'm not lying. I'm just not telling you everything." "That's fair," he said, and didn't push, which surprised her more than if he had. "For what it's worth, whatever it is, you don't have to handle it alone unless you want to." "I do want to," she said, "at least for now." "Then I'll wait," he said simply, and the way he said it, not wounded, not performing patience, just stating a fact, made something in her chest loosen slightly, the first easy breath she'd taken in days. They started spending more time together outside of work, without either of them naming it that way. He came by the office at midnight once, when she was stuck debugging a server outage, brought her coffee and sat across the room, reading something on his phone, not hovering, just present, until she fixed it 3 hours later and looked up to find he'd stayed the entire time without being asked. You didn't have to wait, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to see you solve it. Most men get bored watching someone work. I'm not most men, he said. And it didn't sound like a line. It sounded like something he genuinely believed about himself, which made it land differently than it would have from anyone else. She learned things about him in pieces, that he'd grown up in Seoul, but spent half his 20s in New York, building the fund that eventually let him buy into companies like Halcyon. That he had one older brother he didn't talk about much, a careful kind of silence around the subject that she noticed but didn't push. That he was funnier than his reputation suggested, dry in a way that caught her off guard the first few times, until she started watching for it. You're not what I expected from a billionaire, she told him one night, half joking, sitting on a bench near the Charles River after a walk that had started as a work conversation and turned into something else entirely. What did you expect? Someone who talks about himself more. I find you more interesting than myself, he said. Most people I meet, I have to fill the silence. With you, I don't. She didn't know what to do with how steady that made her feel, after months of being made to feel like too much, like a problem in need of managing. He didn't manage her, he just showed up, consistently, without asking for anything she hadn't already decided to give. The breach traced back fully 3 weeks after Coco first noticed it, and when it did, the floor of her entire understanding of the last 2 years shifted underneath her. She'd been working the trail methodically, the way she approached everything, refusing to jump to conclusions, even when the early evidence pointed somewhere obvious. She cross-referenced timestamps against her own calendar, trying to disprove her own suspicion before she'd let herself believe it. Every single unauthorized access had happened during a window when Holloway had been alone in her apartment, supposedly working on his consulting business. The data pulled wasn't random, it was proprietary research from Halcyon's most valuable pipeline, the kind of information that could be sold to a competitor for a number with a lot of zeros attached. She found the destination eventually, buried under enough layers that it took her 2 more nights to get there, a smaller biotech firm in Waltham that had been aggressively trying to catch up to Halcyon's research for over a year, and working there, according to a LinkedIn profile updated only 6 weeks earlier, was Holloway. She sat with that fact for a long time before she let herself feel anything about it. Not the heartbreak first, that came later, but the cold, clear part of her brain that had built a career out of finding exactly this kind of pattern. He hadn't just borrowed money from her. He hadn't just isolated her from her friends or snapped at her over a sink full of dishes. He had used her own laptop, her own old credentials, to steal from the company that had given her the promotion he resented so much he couldn't even say congratulations. Every late night he claimed to be building his failing consulting business. He'd actually been selling out the company she'd helped build, using access she hadn't realized she'd still left open. She didn't go to Dongbrim first, even though some part of her wanted to. She needed this to be hers, built clean and undeniable, before she handed it to anyone else. She spent a weekend building a full timeline, cross-referencing every data pull against Holloway's known location, his new employer's public records, the shell pattern of access he'd used to cover his tracks. By Monday morning, she had something airtight. She brought it to Bertram first, laying it out point by point in his office, with the door closed. "You're sure about this?" Bertram said, scrolling through what she'd built, his face going pale the longer he read. "I'm sure," she said. "I wouldn't bring it to you if I wasn't. This is going to need legal and probably the board." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm bringing it to you and not posting it on a whiteboard." Word moved fast once it left her hands, the way it always did, in a building full of people, trained to notice patterns. By Wednesday, Halcyon's legal team had opened a formal investigation, and Coco found herself sitting across from two lawyers and Bertram walking through everything a second time, more carefully, knowing now that every word she said would matter in a way it hadn't when it was just her own private suspicion. Dongbrim found out the same day, in a board briefing she wasn't present for, and he came to find her afterward with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Something careful, almost guilty. "You already knew, didn't you?" she said, before he could speak. "About the breach." "Before I told anyone." He didn't deny it, which told her everything before he even opened his mouth. "I suspected something was happening on the investor side for a few months. Unusual movement in a Waltham firm's funding, timed strangely close to gaps in Halcyon's research output. I didn't have proof. I didn't know it was connected to you specifically until you brought it to Bertram. But you suspected Holloway." "I suspected someone close to the company," he said carefully. "I didn't know it was him until I saw the name in the report this morning." "That night at the restaurant," she said slowly, putting pieces together in real time. "You were already watching him before the proposal even happened, weren't you? You didn't just happen to be at that dinner." He was quiet, for a moment too long, which was its own kind of answer. "I knew his family had financial ties to companies I was monitoring. I wanted to see him in person before I decided how seriously to take the pattern I was seeing. So I wasn't a coincidence. I was part of an investigation you were already running." "You were never part of an investigation," he said, his voice tightening. "I was watching him. You walked into the frame entirely on your own, and what happened between us has nothing to do with why I was there that night." "That's not how it feels right now," she said, stepping back from him in the hallway, her arms crossing over her chest like a wall going up brick by brick. "It feels like you used a corporate situation to get close to me and never once mentioned it." "I should have told you sooner," he admitted. "I didn't, because I didn't want you to think this, exactly what's happening right now, was the only reason I was interested in you." "Well, congratulations," she said. "Now, I think it anyway." She walked away from him, not dramatically, just with the quiet finality of someone closing a door they intended to keep closed for a while, and he didn't follow her, which she noticed, and resented, and respected, all at the same time. Real quick, besties, if this story's got you holding your breath right now, that's exactly what I'm going for. Drop a comment and tell me if you think Coco's right to be this angry at him. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and like the video so more people see this story. Okay, back to it. That night, alone in her apartment, she got a call from her mother that made the entire week feel like it was collapsing in on itself at once. "I need to talk to you about something," Denise said, her voice strange, tight in a way Coco hadn't heard before. "And I need you to not be angry at me before I even finish." "What did you do, Mom?" "It's about Holloway's family," Denise said, "and some money they gave me months ago, before any of this happened." Coco closed her eyes, already bracing for whatever was coming next. Some part of her already certain it was going to be worse than she could imagine. $15,000, Denise said, the words coming out fast, like she needed to get them over with, before she lost her nerve. "They gave me $15,000 back in the spring, Holloway's parents." "For what, Mum?" Coco's voice came out flatter than she expected, already exhausted before the answer arrived. "They said it was a loan, for wedding planning, before you two were even officially engaged." Denise's voice cracked slightly. "But it wasn't really a loan. They wanted me to make sure you said yes when he proposed. They knew you'd been pulling away. Holloway told them you'd tried to end things twice already, and they panicked." Coco sat down slowly on the edge of her couch, the room tilting slightly around her. "You took money to convince me to marry a man you knew I was trying to leave." "I didn't see it like that at the time," Denise said. "I thought I was helping. I thought if I just kept encouraging you to, you'd work through whatever was wrong, the way couples do. You knew I tried to end it twice, and you still pushed me toward that proposal. I didn't know how bad it had gotten, Coco. I swear to you, I didn't know he was grabbing your wrist. I didn't know about any of what you've been telling me. You knew enough, Coco said, her voice rising now, the calm cracking apart. You knew I told you I wasn't happy. You knew I asked you, more than once, just to listen to me, instead of telling me how lucky I was to have him. And instead of listening, you took $15,000 to keep pushing me toward a man who was stealing from my own company behind my back. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Coco thought maybe the call had dropped. I'm sorry, Denise finally said, small and broken in a way Coco had genuinely never heard from her mother before. I was wrong. I should have listened to you instead of them. I need some time, Coco said, and hung up before her mother could say anything else, sitting alone in the quiet of her apartment, with the weight of everything pressing down at once. Her job under formal investigation because of the man she'd almost married, her own mother compromised by the very family that had hurt her, and the one person who'd made her feel steady through all of it, now standing on the wrong side of a wall she'd built in a hallway 2 days earlier. She didn't call Dongbrim that night. She didn't call anyone. She sat with it alone, the way she'd learned to sit with hard things long before any of this started, and let herself cry for the first time since the night of the proposal. Not over Holloway, not even fully over her mother, but over the exhausting realization that almost everyone in her life had, in some way, decided her feelings mattered less than keeping the peace. The investigation at Halcyon moved faster than she expected, and not in her favor. Holloway, once he realized he'd been caught, didn't go quietly. He went for the only weapon he had left. By the following week, doctored screenshots started circulating among mutual friends, claiming Coco had fabricated the entire breach out of jealousy after their breakup, that she'd planted the access logs herself to destroy his reputation for humiliating him at the proposal. He leaked private photos from their relationship with captions twisting context, painting himself as the victim of an unstable woman who couldn't handle rejection, even though it had been her rejection in the first place. It worked better than it should have. Halcyon's legal team, faced with conflicting narratives and a very loud, very public smear campaign, made the call to suspend Coco pending a full independent review, not because they believed Holloway, but because the optics had gotten messy enough that someone above Bertram wanted to be cautious. This is temporary, Bertram told her, unable to meet her eyes across his desk. It's procedural. Nobody actually thinks you fabricated anything. It doesn't feel temporary from where I'm sitting, Coco said, already packing the contents of her desk into a single box. The same desk where she'd built a career she was proud of, now treating her like a liability instead of the person who'd caught the actual crime. She walked out of Halcyon's building that afternoon with a box under her arm and nowhere she particularly wanted to go. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dong Brim. I heard about the suspension. I'm sorry. Call me if you want to talk. And she stared at it for a long moment before putting the phone back in her pocket without responding. She wasn't angry at him anymore, not really. She was just tired, and being alone felt safer than needing anyone, even someone who'd been honest with her in every way that mattered, except the one that had stung the most. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, surrounded by the box of belongings from a job she might not get back, her mother estranged, her name dragged through gossip she hadn't created, Coco felt closer to giving up than she had at any point since the night she'd said no in front of 40 people. But giving up had never actually been in her nature, not even when everything around her suggested it might be easier than fighting. She opened her laptop, pulled up the external drive she'd backed everything up to weeks earlier, the drive Holloway didn't know existed, and started building her case again from scratch, this time with the full understanding that nobody, not her company, not her mother, not even the man who loved her, was going to fix this for her. She was going to fix it herself, the way she'd built everything else in her life that actually mattered. It took her 4 days to rebuild the case into something undeniable, working from her kitchen table with takeout containers piling up beside her laptop, sleeping in short stretches between sessions of pulling logs, timestamps, and metadata that Holloway hadn't even known existed because he didn't understand the systems he'd been stealing from well enough to cover his tracks completely. She found something new this time, something she hadn't had room to notice during the rush of the first investigation. The Waltham firm Holloway worked for wasn't operating independently. Buried in a chain of shell company filings, public records that took hours of digging through state business registries to untangle, she found the entity that had actually funded the acquisition of the stolen research. It traced back to a holding company registered in New Hampshire. The listed director was a name she recognized immediately, a name that made her hands go still on the keyboard for a long moment before she kept working. Holloway's father. It hadn't been Holloway acting alone out of bitterness and a failing consulting business. His own father had set up the structure to receive and launder the stolen research, funneling it through a shell company specifically designed to obscure exactly this kind of family involvement. The engagement, the public proposal, the pressure on Denise to keep pushing Coco toward marriage, none of it had been about love or even pride. It had been about keeping her close enough, trusting enough that nobody would think to look at the family running the operation behind their golden son. She sat back from her laptop, exhausted and furious in equal measure, and for the first time in days, picked up her phone and actually called someone. "I need a formal review meeting with the board," she said, when Bertram answered, not bothering with a greeting. Not an informal one. "The full board. I have everything. Coco, you're suspended. You can't just... I can request a formal hearing as the original reporting party," she said. "It's in the employee handbook. You know it is. I've read it twice in the last 4 days to make sure I had this exactly right." There was a pause, and then, to his credit, Bertram exhaled and said, "I'll set it up. Wednesday. Be ready." She spent the 2 days before the hearing preparing the way she prepared for everything that mattered, methodically, refusing to let emotion cloud the structure of what she needed to present. She didn't call Dong Brim, though she thought about it more than once, her thumb hovering over his name in her contacts before she put the phone down again each time. She needed to walk into that boardroom, standing entirely on her own, not as someone propped up by a man on the board, but as the engineer who'd caught the breach in the first place. Wednesday morning, she walked into Halcyon's largest conference room, wearing the same kind of sharp, simple outfit she'd have worn to any other presentation, refusing to dress like someone asking for forgiveness. 12 board members sat around the table. Dong Brim was among them, his face giving nothing away, professional in a way that told her he understood exactly what this moment needed to be. Holloway sat near the end of the table too, invited as the accused party with a right to respond, smug in a way that made her stomach turn the second she saw his face. "Ms. Addison," the board chair said, "you requested this hearing. The floor is yours." She didn't waste time on an opening statement. She pulled up the timeline on the screen, walking through it piece by piece, calm and clear, her voice never wavering, even as she laid out the most damning parts. "The access logs show a consistent pattern of unauthorized data pulls over a 7-month period," she said, "all occurring during windows when Mr. Holloway was alone in my apartment. using credentials tied to my old employee account that should have been deactivated but were never fully purged from a legacy authentication server. I've cross-referenced every single pull against his known location during those windows. This is exactly what I told you, Holloway interrupted, looking around the table. She's still obsessed with me. She built this entire narrative because I rejected her plan to humiliate me publicly. You proposed to me in front of your family after I told you 3 times I wasn't ready, Coco said, not raising her voice, not giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't build a narrative. I built a timeline. There's a difference. She continued, walking the board through the destination of the stolen data, the Waltham firm, the shell company registered in New Hampshire. She watched Holloway's smug expression start to falter the moment she put his father's name on the screen. That's not. You can't prove my father had anything to do with this, he said, his voice rising now, the calm performance finally cracking. I can, Coco said, because state business filings are public record, and your father is listed as the director of the holding company that funded the acquisition of the stolen data. The room had gone very quiet. She pulled up one more thing, a final piece she'd saved for exactly this moment. I also have this, she said, and played a voicemail through the conference room speakers. One Holloway had left her drunk, months before the engagement, that she'd kept, without quite knowing why at the time. His own voice filled the room, slurred and bitter, bragging about how he was going to get back at the company that promoted her over him, how he had people who'd pay real money for what she had access to. Holloway's face had gone pale, his mouth opening and closing without finding words. You kept that, he said quietly, the fight draining out of his voice for the first time since the hearing started. I kept a lot of things, Coco said. I just finally found a use for them. The board chair cleared his throat. Miss Addison, thank you. We'll need time to deliberate, but I think it's safe to say the picture here is considerably clearer than it was an hour ago. The board's deliberation didn't take nearly as long as Coco expected. By Friday morning, Halcyon's legal team had referred the entire matter to federal authorities. Holloway's employment at the Waltham firm was terminated the same day his employer learned about the source of the stolen research, and his father's holding company became the subject of a federal investigation that, according to a brief news article Coco found while scrolling late one night, was expanding into several other companies he'd quietly been laundering data through over the past few years. Coco's suspension was lifted with a formal apology from the board chair, who personally called to tell her the investigation had been closed and her position fully reinstated, along with an offer she hadn't expected, a promotion to lead Halcyon's entire security division, a role created specifically because of what she'd uncovered and how she'd handled it. You did the company a service most security professionals only dream of catching, the chair told her on the phone. We'd be foolish not to put you in charge of making sure it never happens again. She said yes without needing time to think about it, the first easy decision she'd made in weeks. Holloway's family, once so eager to perform a perfect engagement dinner in front of 40 witnesses, went quiet online almost overnight, their social media scrubbed of every photo from that night, their names appearing instead in news coverage about corporate espionage and federal charges. Coco felt something complicated when she saw the coverage. Not joy exactly, but a kind of grim relief that the truth had finally outpaced the performance. Her mother showed up at her apartment on a Sunday afternoon, unannounced, standing on the doorstep with an envelope in her hands and an expression Coco hadn't seen on her before. Not defensive, not explaining, just quiet. I want to give this back to you, Denise said, holding out the envelope. It's not all 15,000. I don't have that kind of money sitting around, but it's what I could put together, and I'm going to keep paying the rest back until it's done. Coco didn't take the envelope right away. Why now? Because I should have done it the day I told you about it, instead of waiting to see how things played out, Denise said. I was scared of how you'd look at me. I'm still scared, but that's not a reason to keep avoiding it. I'm not ready to forgive you, Coco said honestly. Not all the way. Maybe not for a while. I'm not asking you to, Denise said. I'm just asking you to let me keep showing up, even if it takes time. Coco took the envelope then, not as an acceptance of everything, but as a small door left open instead of shut completely, and her mother seemed to understand the difference, because she didn't push for more than that, just nodded and asked if she could come in for coffee, and Coco said yes. It took longer for her to reach out to Dong Brim than it had to forgive her own mother, even partially. Mostly because the wound he'd caused was tangled up with something she hadn't let herself name yet. Not just anger that he'd withheld information, but fear of how much she'd already let herself feel for a man whose motives she'd questioned the moment things got complicated. He didn't push either. He sent one text a week after her reinstatement. I'm proud of how you handled the hearing. I mean that as someone who watched it happen, not as anything more than that, and then nothing else, giving her exactly the space she'd needed without making her ask for it twice. She showed up at his office 2 weeks later, unannounced, the same way her mother had shown up at her door. You could have told me you suspected him before that night at the restaurant, she said, standing in his doorway, no preamble, no easing into it. I could have, he agreed, setting down whatever he'd been reading. I was wrong not to. Why didn't you? Because the first time I saw you, really saw you, was the night you said no to a man 40 people expected you to say yes to, he said. I didn't want the first real conversation we had to start with me telling you I'd been investigating your fiancé for months. I wanted you to know me as someone who respected what you'd just done, not someone with an agenda. You still had an agenda. I did, he admitted, but it stopped being about Holloway within about a week of knowing you. I just didn't know how to separate the two cleanly enough to tell you, and the longer I waited, the harder it got to find the right moment. She studied him for a long moment, weighing the honesty of it against the hurt that was still sitting somewhere underneath her ribs. I'm still angry you didn't tell me sooner, she said. I know, he said. You're allowed to be. I'm also still standing in your office instead of leaving, she pointed out. I noticed that too, he said, and something in his face finally loosened into the kind of small, careful smile she'd missed more than she wanted to admit. What does that mean, exactly? It means I'm choosing to stay, she said. Not because I need you to fix anything, I already fixed it myself, but because I want to, and that's a different thing entirely. I'd never confuse the two, he said. I never wanted to be the reason you got through this. I wanted to be the person standing next to you while you did it yourself. That's a good answer, she said. I've had a few weeks to think about how to say it right, he admitted, and she laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember. 3 months later, Coco sat on the front steps of Halcyon's building after hours, her new title still feeling slightly unfamiliar in her mouth when she introduced herself to new hires, the building behind her quiet, except for the hum of servers she now had full authority over protecting. Dong Brim sat beside her, his tie loosened, a rare softness in his posture that only showed up when no one else was around to see it. Your mother called me today, he said. Coco raised an eyebrow. Why would my mother call you? She wanted to know my intentions, he said, deadpan. I believe the word she used was serious. Oh my God, Coco said, laughing despite the embarrassment creeping up her neck. I'm so sorry. Don't be. I told her my intentions were exactly as serious as she hoped they'd be, he said. She seemed satisfied with that answer. She's trying, Coco said, more to herself than to him. It's slow, but she's trying. So are you, he said. With her, I mean. Yeah, Coco admitted. I am. The investigation into Holloway's father had expanded over the months into something much larger than anyone initially expected, pulling in 2 other shell companies and a network of stolen research spanning several biotech firms across the state, the kind of case that made it onto actual news segments instead of just local gossip. Holloway himself had been charged separately, his name now permanently tied to corporate espionage rather than the Golden Sun reputation he'd spent years building. Coco felt nothing when she saw his name in print anymore, which felt like its own kind of victory, quieter than she expected, but real all the same. "Can I ask you something?" she said, watching the lights of Cambridge flicker on across the river as the sky dimmed. "Anything. Are you ever going to tell me about your brother, the one you go quiet about?" He was silent for a moment, long enough that she thought maybe she'd pushed somewhere he wasn't ready to go yet. "Eventually," he said finally, "not because I don't trust you, because some things take longer to say out loud than others, and I'd rather tell you right than tell you fast." "I can respect that," she said. "I'm not in a rush." "I know," he said. "That's one of the things I love about you. You never make anyone feel rushed into anything except yourself, apparently, which you do constantly." "I contain multitudes," she said, and he laughed, a real laugh. The kind she'd learned over the past few months was rare enough to count as a small gift every time it happened. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at it, expecting a work notification, and instead found an email with a subject line that made her sit up straighter. An encrypted file request from an unknown sender, no name attached, just a single line in the body. "I think you'll want to see this before anyone else does." "What is it?" Dong Brim asked, noticing the shift in her posture. "I don't know yet," she said slowly, already opening the attachment, her engineer's instincts kicking in faster than her sense of caution. "But something tells me this isn't over." He leaned over to look at the screen with her, his shoulder pressed against hers, steady the way he'd been steady through everything since the night he found her shaking on a sidewalk with no coat and a destroyed engagement behind her. "Whatever it is," he said, "you won't be figuring it out alone." "I know," she said, and for the first time since this entire nightmare started, the thought of not being alone didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like a choice she'd made on her own terms, the same way she'd made every other choice that actually mattered. Clear-eyed, unafraid, and exactly as smart as everyone around her had finally been forced to admit she was. She closed her laptop halfway, just enough to pause the moment, and looked out at the river one more time before turning back to the file, waiting to be opened, ready for whatever came next, because she always had been, long before anyone else figured that out. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you for riding this story out with me. This is exactly the kind of story I love telling, and I've got a lot more like it coming. Drop a comment and let me know what you think happens with that file. Hit subscribe if you're new here so you catch the next one, and like the video if Coco earned it for you tonight. See you in the next story.